Hello, I'm Miss Kilburn-Bond. In this video we're going to be looking at revising persuasive language techniques. So first of all we'll revisit your knowledge of a range of techniques, rhetorical devices that are used by writers to persuade their target reader to support their viewpoint. I'm sure that a lot of these techniques you'll have come across before. But secondly and importantly, we're then going to think about how we understand how those techniques achieve their persuasive impact. Because if you understand how they achieve the impact, then you can be much more successful in using them in your own writing. So first of all, let's just check that we're all happy with the understanding of that word persuasion. So if we look up in a dictionary, then we'll find that persuasion is a noun and it means the action or process of persuading someone or of being persuaded to do or believe something. And if you're writing in a way that's meant to get your reader to be on board with your way of thinking, to come round to your argument, then you need to be able to have techniques that are going to allow you to have that action, that process of persuading someone to come round to your way of thinking. And I really like this quote at the end. I think the power of persuasion would be the greatest superpower of all time. Learning persuasive techniques isn't going to only be helpful for your school life. Being able to persuade people throughout your life in all sorts of situations, but importantly, realising how other people are trying to persuade you is going to be a really important superpower that you can take with you. So I've broken down the techniques into different themes, if you like, and we're going to start by looking at how persuasive techniques can create a relationship with the reader. And the obvious place to start is to look at personal address. That's when a writer directly addresses the reader, making that reader feel like you're in a relationship with each other. It's important that you're part of that writing and you're listening to what's being said. And often what we find to create a personal address is an immediate use of inclusive personal pronouns. So they are words like I, you, we, our, and us. And what those words do is they create this effect where the reader feels like the writer's talking directly to them and including them in their argument. So let's look at some examples of that inclusive pronoun in action. So you've got quite a few examples there on the screen. We'll have a little look through some of them. We are making good progress, but there's still so much to do. So using we, making your reader feel like you're in this together. You are waiting to be told in that second quotation there. You should feel about being you. You are waiting to be told, let's be honest, about how happy and hopeful you should feel about being you. That repetition of the word you there, it's impossible to read that as a reader without feeling like you are being directly addressed by the writer. And all of these examples are from real writing by professional writers who have written in a way that's trying to get people to be on board with their viewpoint. The third one, our primary role as parents and educators is to help develop independent learners and thinkers. So a bit like with the we in the first one, trying to make everybody feel like you're in a team, you're in this together. And the same with that last one, we've got as we look ahead, we must keep sight of our shared mission. So hopefully you can hear how using inclusive pronouns is a really good way to quickly establish a relationship with your reader. Now similarly, still using pronouns, you can then use exclusive pronouns to create a different effect. Because if you're using words like they and them rather than I, us, we, what you can do is create the sense of a separate group that are different from us, different from the writer and the reader. And that can be really helpful when you're trying to put across an argument where there might be a different point of view, a group of people who you want to set up as being different and not as included in what you're saying. So if we have a look at some examples of this in action, we've got things will change, they promised. That exclusive pronoun making this promise that sounds like it's being broken as part of a separate group that doesn't really include the reader and definitely not the writer. They look down their nose at jobs in places such as fast food restaurants or shops. You can see that there's a feeling of almost disgust there being expressed about this other group of people using those exclusive pronouns. It starts with a failure because failure is the best teacher, the best lesson, and they don't teach this. Again, setting up a group of people who are different and separate to the writer and the reader. and still thinking about forming that relationship between writer and reader, we can also use colloquial language. So that's casual, relaxed language, the kind of language you might use in a really informal situation, just chatting to your friends, for example. Colloquial language can really change the tone of an article, make it seem more friendly, sometimes create humour. If we look at these 3 examples here, the first one, just simply using the word okay. Okay, let's start with a confession. I'm a bit of a Kanye fan. That immediately sounds quite friendly. This isn't a writer who is trying to intimidate you as the reader. Me, I thought. OBE, me, up yours, I thought. So we can see there's some humour there, slightly offensive use of colloquial language, but again, it's giving us this impression of a writer who's got really strong opinions and who is also willing to be quite casual and relaxed in the way that the writer's engaging with us as the reader. And similarly in that last one, if you scan through it, you can see in bold, ends with good riddance, and then you go on ahead, lads, we'll be right behind you. So again, creating that informality, making it a piece of writing that's not intimidating. Now let's look at flattery. So complimenting your audience is obviously going to be a good way of forming a good relationship with your reader. So flattery in action now. Let's look at the first one. Finally, the biggest reason for hope is because you, the children and young people of today, are taking the lead on demanding urgent action, empowering yourselves to learn about and shape the world around you. So telling your audience, your target reader, that they're already the people who are taking the lead is flattering them, is going to make them feel good, and then they're more likely to continue to support your argument. The same with the second one. You deserve much better than this, really persuasive, argumentative statement. And then at the end, your voice really matters, making that reader feel like they're really important. We can't be heard without your passionate support of this important cause. And you'll notice there's many of those personal pronouns at work there as well. A rhetorical question, one I'm sure you're all really confident with already, a question which doesn't expect an answer, but in posing the question, you're forcing your reader to engage with what their answer might be, or you're directing them towards the answer that you actually want them to have. So rhetorical questions really frequently found in pieces of persuasive writing. Here's some examples here. What answer will you get from the academic sorting hat about your current potential, your future prospects? Just as we wouldn't let our children eat 10 Big Macs a day, why let them spend 10 hours staring at their screens? So what can we do to move away from junk tech? But is addiction to video games a real addiction? So you can see that some of those questions are forcing the reader to think bigger than perhaps what the article can fit in. Some of those questions are directing the reader to come to an answer. It'd be difficult to give a different one, and it plays into the power of the argument that's being expressed by that writer. Now, anecdotes work really well when you're creating a relationship with your reader. An anecdote or anecdotal evidence is where you include usually a very short story, an account of a personal experience, and they're often used as evidence that supports a sort of real life example of whatever the issue is that's being discussed. So if we look at how these could work in action, we've got this first one here from an article. I recently heard of a head teacher commenting, "We do not need to teach children history, we just need to teach them how to Google the topic and they can find it out for themselves." Now, by telling this as a story, rather than just making a statement that some people don't believe we need to teach children history, telling it as something that's actually been overheard in a real life situation makes it feel more personal, a story that we can relate to, shows that this is something that's really happening in society. So you can see that anecdote makes it more powerful. The second one adds some humour. You'll hear that as we go through it. Being middle-aged and overweight myself, I'd much rather obsess over my dog's caloric intake, restricting him to a grim diet of fibrous kibble, than address my own food regimen and relinquish, heaven forbid, my morning cinnamon bun. So giving us a little bit of insight into the writer's personal life and their sense of humour helps us have that relationship with the reader and the writer. It helps them see that this is someone who sounds quite real. They've got a sense of humour, they're talking about their diet, they're talking about their dog. everything about them then makes them someone that you start to trust more and relate to, and that can mean that they can put their argument forward in a more powerful way. And then the last one, on a recent work trip to the French capital, I decided to give up on my car and driver in favour of short, whizzy trips on these rent-by-the-minute scooters, which can be found on any street corner. So this was from an article arguing for and against the idea of having these scooters. If you're able to then talk about a real-life experience where you have experienced one, then that's going to mean that your argument is going to have more power, be more convincing. So once you've got that relationship established between the reader and writer, you want to think about how you can make your points, make your argument more powerful. And techniques that can help you do this include repetition, using the same word or phrase more than once to create a specific effect. And that often is adding emphasis. You're picking out words that you really want to have power and weight in your article. So if we look at some different examples here, these figures cannot be anything but a source of deep, deep shame for our country. That sentence would work well with just one deep, but by choosing to repeat that word twice in succession, then it's really forcing us to have to think about that word. It has that emphasis and that power, and because it's talking about shame, then you can see it's quite an emotional, powerful argument. We are awesome in our power to change things and awesome in our power to save ourselves. And in the next 40 days, we must choose what kind of awesome we are going to be. So there we've got the 3 repetition of that word awesome, and what that does is it creates a sort of sound pattern as we're listening. This was actually from a persuasive speech, so through repeating that word awesome, we're drawing the audience's attention to it, and we're really making it a bit like a drum beat as a message that we want to be remembered. Similarly, in that third one, our burning of fossil fuels, our destruction of nature, our approach to industry. So you've got the 3 repetitions again with the our, and the word that comes afterwards is different, but the pattern, our burning, our destruction, our approach, is creating a repetitive phrase that means that it immediately sounds different to us as the audience, and that creates emphasis and impact. And actually that last example can also be called anaphora, because the repetition of the same word or phrase at the start of successive clauses or phrases is called anaphora, and that's what's happening there, because at the start of each phrase, our, and our, we get this really tight, neat example of repetition that's very cleverly being constructed by the writer to make this argument have full strength. A superlative is another good way of adding that power to your argument. Superlative means expressing the highest form of something. So if you were to say, that's the largest animal, or they were the most angry person in the room, you would be expressing the highest form of something using a superlative. So a superlative can also be used to add strength and to suggest that something couldn't be any better or any worse or any bigger, for example. The climate crisis is both the easiest and hardest issue we have ever faced. So easiest and hardest, we've got 2 contrasts there, but they're both superlatives, and that is showing us that the climate crisis is something that is so hugely important that the most extreme words at both ends of the spectrum are being used to talk about it. It's also quite curious to think about how something could be both the easiest and the hardest, so that gets us wanting to find out how that's going to be explored further. We're the first and only vegan football club, and the first to be certified as carbon neutral by the United Nations. When you visit the new lawn, you can see what makes FGR the world's greenest football club by following our eco trail. So we've got several superlatives here. We've got this idea of the first and the only, and then we've also got the greenest. So that's making this football club sound special, and using that idea of specialness is then a way of getting your audience to really buy into what you're trying to say and what you're arguing for. And similarly, that final one, we are after all the greatest problem solvers to have ever existed on Earth. There's a little bit of flattery again happening here, but using the superlative greatest to try and give hope to the readers or the audience of this particular sentence. Now, another really powerful technique that you need to have to hand is an imperative command. So an imperative is instructional language that's directed at the reader. It's basically when you are telling your reader, your audience, that they need to do something or not do something. So you're looking for the verbs that give that imperative command. So in these examples, the first one, but don't let simple sympathy edge toward the tragic. So we've got don't let, so telling the reader, controlling the reader's response, if you like. Ditch that soccer game appearance if you feel like it. Your kid will be fine. But when you are with your child, put down your damn phone. So we've got two examples of the imperative commands here. In the first sentence, ditch that soccer game appearance. So colloquial language 2, telling the reader what to do. And then at the end of that phrase, put down your damn phone. So again, commanding the reader, because having made this powerful argument in this case about screen time, there's an instruction from the writer as to what they think the reader should do. Third example, I implore you, implore means beg, I implore you to hunt out our voices and educate yourself, rather than relying on us to provide you with every tool and piece of information you need. So we've got these imperatives here, implore and educate, again making this kind of plea to the reader as to how they need to respond to the argument. And similarly, in that final example, we've got this lovely triplet, protect us, guide us, rewild us. So we've also got the repetition there, but protect, guide and rewild are our three verbs. There are three imperative commands telling us as the reader what we need to do. Hyperbole can be a really clever technique when you're writing persuasively, because hyperbole means using exaggeration for effect. So if we look at an example from 3 different articles here, the first one, this is the most self-obsessed generation for centuries. The for centuries part of that sentence adds the hyperbole, exaggerates it beyond what's probably reasonable to state and claim. While we await your decision, the whole school holds its breath. Literally, the whole school wasn't holding its breath in that moment, but using that hyperbole really creates this sense of tension and importance and how everybody is waiting on the reader and how they're going to react. And then the final one, it will be a miracle if we make it through the lesson without the exam being mentioned again. The definition of miracle isn't really being literally used here, it's being exaggerated, and that could create humour, it could create shock, but it's definitely going to make an argument more powerful where it's used. Now, emotive language, really important in persuasive writing, especially for certain topics and certain readers. So emotive language is language which triggers an emotional response in the reader, and that can really be any emotional response. So it could be humour, it could be shock. Often it's used to talk particularly about sort of guilt, shame, sadness, anger, fury, upset, frustration. So when we're looking for examples, we can see in that first one, it could simply just be one word. We've got that terrifying here. These issues land on the desks of secondary school teachers with terrifying frequency. Now, if we remove the word terrifying from that sentence, it still makes sense, but terrifying gives it emotive power. It makes it more emotional. It brings in this idea of something being terrifying and being on the other side of that, being feeling terror. With that in mind, here are 8 reasons why I'm worried for your future and 8 reasons why I think there is hope. So we've got 2 different emotions here. We've got the worry and the concern, which could lead to fear in the reader, but then we've also got the hope, so we've got that positive spin too. The rabbits writhe in agony. Hopefully the emotive power of that one's quite obvious to you all. And then finally, in 2012, a whistleblower released a video of a military trauma training course in which participants and instructors laughed as live goats had their legs broken and amputated with tree trimmers. And that example I've put in there because that's a really particularly shocking one where the most distressing part of that sentence is left to the end to really shock and alarm the reader, so you then are more likely to support the argument of the writer. When you're writing persuasively, you need to be developing a strong, convincing viewpoint. You can't, in one paragraph, get everything out and finish. You're going to have to really think about how you structure and create a sequenced viewpoint that continues from the beginning right to the end of your text. So some of these techniques will help you with that. And an obvious one is the use of facts and statistics, including provable information that can be checked, data from surveys, studies, etc. That's going to make you sound more reliable, trustworthy. It's going to give you power and status, which can be really helpful when you're putting forward an argument. So there are a couple of different examples here. So you might expect to see percentages. You can see in that first example, we've got 15% of secondary school children doing 2 hours of PE a week, 70% of under 10s no longer learning dance. So sometimes a fact and statistic is simply bringing in from different studies and research things like percentages. The second one, a little bit different. Dozens of studies have shown correlations between video game use and improved spatial processing, multitasking, attentional control and perseverance. We don't have a specific percentage here, but what we do have is a reference to there being dozens of studies, which still has the impact of showing that there is research and facts behind the argument that's being presented. And then we've gone back to percentages in that last one. Since around the time you were both born, we have lost between 40 and 50% of all the world's wildlife. So you can see using a fact, those statistics, those percentages, to bring in some shocking information. Now the triple, sometimes called a triplet or the rule of three or even the power of three, is a very well-known technique that's used by writers, by speakers, to list 3 ideas or phrases and put them together. And there's a lot of research that when we're on the receiving end of that, having those patterns of 3 can be more powerful than presented in any other number. So for that reason, you'll often hear politicians in particular talking in that triplet pattern. So here's some examples from some persuasive writing. I've had my time in the world of self-harm, panic and anxiety. So you can see 2, then the word and then the third, the end of that triple there, really makes that sentence have more powerful. Those 3 words, then the self-harm, the panic and anxiety, then become like a little family that stand out in that sentence. There is an expectation, an implication, a pressure when you're the parent of an autistic child. So very similar impact there. So let's reflect on what's been achieved, establish what needs to be done, and work together to create a world where every young person can be themselves. So that's a sentence that's very much looking forward, talking about what we can do, that sort of imperative command in a way, but putting those 3 ideas together, giving it that repetitive triplet power. So another technique to be aware of is antithesis, putting 2 opposite ideas together to highlight contrasts. So if we look at that first one, but while I may be the first woman in this office, I will not be the last. You'll see in bold we've got the words first and last deliberately contrasted. And that makes this statement, this very confident statement about the future, to have that power and when you're listening, to really stand out and work as a team to make this writing more interesting. We are weeks away from the UN climate conference in Glasgow, but seemingly light years away from reaching our targets. So same kind of intention, using 2 contrasting antithesis, weeks versus light years, to put forward a really powerful statement. In my lifetime, I've witnessed a terrible decline. In yours, you could and should witness a wonderful recovery. It's a really interesting one here because we've got the repetition of witness in both. They're not opposites, but the antithesis comes in with the terrible decline and the wonderful recovery. And those 2 sentences are then absolutely bound together like glue. And as the reader, as the audience, you can't help but then look at that contrast, and what that's telling us is actually talking about the climate. And then finally, sometimes we simply have to be cruel to be kind. So much more simple there, but putting those 2 opposites, the cruelty and the kindness, together to make a statement, to give an opinion. And that brings us neatly to thinking about opinions, because you can't deliver your viewpoint and write persuasively without really giving your judgments, your views, and making those in your statements. So a statement where you say what you think or believe, but that can't be proved because it's an individual's opinion. So if we look at that first one, that's why Britain and France teamed up to make Concorde, which is my absolute favourite machine in the world. Really obvious opinion there, actually stating this is my favourite. That sentence can't belong to anyone else except for this particular writer. The second one, however, the message that we should worry less about screen time announced with such brazen confidence is frankly irresponsible. At this time, we've actually got the opinion being in response to other people's statements and it being left to the end of that sentence to give it that real power. Frankly irresponsible. So there's no doubt where the writer sits in this particular debate. And then the final one, talking about a sports person writing persuasively about who it is they admire. This writer said, Serena's determination in coming back year after year is what really inspires me. So again, we're absolutely clear of the opinion of that writer. What you need to be aware of, though, is that some writers, and you in your writing will need to try this out, they give opinions as if they're actually facts. It's a very clever technique when we're trying to persuade people. So when an opinion is stated categorically as if it's a provable fact, then we can call that an opinion stated as a fact. So in these three examples, hopefully you can see how this works. We look at that first one, animal testing is cruel and barbaric. That statement, using that word is, suggests it's a fact. But if you start to unpick it, that writer cannot really put that sentence forward as a scientifically kind of logical, proven, indisputable fact. There would obviously be people who would challenge that point of view. So that's an opinion stated as a fact. It's much more persuasive. Amid the turbulence of second waves and local lockdowns, the best that employers can do right now is offer a phased and flexible return to the office, closely evaluating risks as they go. That sentence is put across with a lot of authority. It sounds like a fact, but when you think about it, whose opinion is that? It's the writer's opinion that is the best that employers can do. That's not actually grounded in anything that's logical and can be proven as scientific fact. And then the final one, but one thing's for sure, things are changing and not necessarily for the better. Now that first phrase there, but one thing's for sure, makes us think that actually this is going to be a fact. It's stated with such confidence, but not necessarily for the better is absolutely only ever the writer's opinion. Then for our final theme, if you like, we're going to look at how we can also create special effects with figurative language. So techniques that you might normally associate with studying poetry and novels actually have a really important place when we're thinking about persuasive non-fiction writing too. So similes and metaphors, you'll be very familiar with these techniques. A simile, comparing one thing with another using as or like. A metaphor, using an image or an idea to represent something else. They have their place in persuasive writing too. And here are some examples. Waiting for the politicians to act on this crisis is like watching paint dry. There's our simile. From the moment Betty's family pulled the purple silk away to reveal sculptor Eve Shepherd's creation in all its bronze beauty and magnificence, it felt like a new dawn for Wales. There's our second simile. So using similes here to make the writing more interesting, to give readers imagery, to enable them to engage with that piece of writing so it doesn't feel like you're just listing one fact or opinion after another without all those techniques in writing that make us able to imagine and think bigger than necessarily just the words on the page. Let's look at some metaphors then. No rah-rah or bling, no headlines or declaring himself a king, just the coolest cat on the pitch and purring in every way. So we've got some great colloquial language in that one too, but if we look at that coolest cat on the pitch followed up by the purring, we've got a really nice extended metaphor there. Young people are already armed with much of this knowledge. Now, as a metaphor, might be easier to miss in some ways because it's over so quickly, but actually young people are already armed. That word armed says so much, all the connotations that what they're armed with, that knowledge, is actually something that's powerful, that they could almost go into battle with. So that's really quite a very clever little metaphor there. And then the final one, avoiding climate breakdown will require cathedral thinking. We must lay the foundation while we may not know exactly how to build the ceiling. So this metaphor, an extended metaphor, feels much bigger, more complicated. We've got this idea that avoiding a climate breakdown needs that cathedral thinking, and then using this idea of this kind of huge, important architect sort of design of a cathedral and the way we're going to have to think about it is then reinforced with more metaphors, laying foundations and building ceilings. So a different type of metaphor would be a personification, which is a metaphor. It's when you give an inanimate thing lifelike qualities, hence the image there of a toaster with a smiley face. So personification often found in poetry, but also found in persuasive non-fiction writing. The screen itself is not at fault. That is neither here nor there, but the applications and games on it are bent on bewitching the masses. An application, a game, talking about, on a phone or a computer, they can't be bent on bewitching something. They don't have the power of individual thought to do that. But by using bent on bewitching the masses, it reinforces this idea that applications and games are in some way kind of magical, in a dark magic kind of way. The memory leapt up and attacked my previous sense of well-being, making the memory there become something that's personified and becomes difficult and aggressive. Time and tide wait for no one. If we don't act now, it's too late for our children's future. So time and tide waiting, they're not really waiting. They can't think and decide they're going to wait for something. But using that metaphor then adds that sense of urgency to talking about this piece of writing and what we've got to act on now so it's not too late for our children's future. Now, thinking about the sound of a text is also important because sound is part of how we experience reading. Even if we're reading silently, picking up on things like alliteration and assonance is affecting the power that some words have and can bring connections between several words together. So alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds in a series of words, and assonance is a repetition of vowel sounds in a series of words. So if we look at these in some persuasive writing, we can see it in that first example. We've got guides and gurus. So as a really good example of alliteration, the consonant sounds there are guides and gurus if we embark on this process, people who would be glad to share their wisdom. So that brings a really nice sound to this sentence, but it also puts those two guides and gurus knitted together. With clarity of vision and purpose, they are determined to tackle climate change and build back the beauty we all need to help us thrive. So we've got build, back and beauty. And I find it impossible to read that sentence without those three words really sounding more powerful and strong when they're said so close together, which fits in really neatly with the fact that the sentence is talking about this idea of focusing on building back, which is something that's powerful and strong. Then if we look at this next one, your attention is no longer your own as it is pushed and pulled by algorithms. So that one's actually got alliteration but also some assonance there. So we've got the p alliteration, and then which is a kind of plosive sound, but we've also got the assonance with the pushed and the pulled. So again, it makes those words feel like they can't be separated. They become really strong working together. If we look at it in the context of the sentence, it's saying that that's what's happening with algorithms. It's making your attention no longer your own, and pushed and pulled being so powerful in that sentence, if we think about the sound, then reinforces the meaning. And then finally, that's both disingenuous and dangerous. So again, we've got that assonance with the us sound at the end, but we've also got the alliteration with the dis and the danger at the start of dangerous. So again, those words then become really powerful, really strong, and they work together to make that sentence sound like it's a really important part of the argument. Now, there are more techniques that we could spend time looking at, but we've gone through some of the most important ones there. And you'll find if you look online for different ways to revise these techniques, there are many mnemonics which will help you or suggest there are ways in which you can learn the techniques and then go into exam or an assessment or just into a piece of writing and simply use that to make sure you include all of them. That's great if it helps you remember them, but just a word of warning, you never need to include all of these techniques in one piece of writing. They're a bit like a toolkit for a writer. There are lots and lots to choose from, but what's important is that you think first about how you want to put your argument across. You do not need to use these like a tick list where you absolutely use one and then the next one and then the next one. They're there for you to choose from, like a menu of techniques where some might help you in one piece of writing and in another piece of writing they might not be necessary. So what can you do next then to become really confident about using these techniques? Well, you can learn the terminology so you're confident about spotting it, labelling it and explaining its impact. That's obviously a good thing to do. But then you need to practice that, otherwise you're not going to remember it. So some advice for you when you're revising persuasive techniques is to spot the techniques literally everywhere. On food packaging, often on the side of a juice carton, for example, there will be some writing, and it's a mini piece of persuasive writing often. See what you can do with that. See if you can unpick any techniques that are being used and why they might be there. Listen to political speeches on television, for example. Read online blogs. Look at the junk mail that comes through the letterbox, often charity letters, for example. How is that using persuasive writing? Look on advertising billboards if you're on a bus and travelling through town. Wherever you are, read the text, name the techniques used, and then see if you can practice, and this could be writing, but you could just talk it out to somebody else. What is it that the writers tried to do to have impact on their target audience? And then practice persuasive writing, but you don't need to do that each time as a great, long, complicated piece of writing. Just do it in miniature. So use the techniques to support you in changing the mind of your intended reader in just a few sentences. That brings us to the end of the video. I really hope that's helped you and you feel now like we've revisited knowledge of a range of those techniques, rhetorical devices, so you're confident in understanding which techniques you might want to do some more revision and practice with, but also, importantly, that you've got an idea about how exactly those techniques achieve their persuasive impact, so you can make really sensible, intelligent decisions before you try to use one yourself. I'm going to leave you with that quote again because I really do think it's worth thinking about when you are going into the world, either as a writer or as a reader or as someone in the audience listening to a speech. I think the power of persuasion would be the greatest superpower of all time. Thanks for listening.